What is up, theology nerds? This is the Homebrewed Christianity Podcast. My name is Tripp, and today we are going to talk about altars. The altars where we worship. That's actually the book title. The altars where we worship, the religious significance of pop culture. So if you're sitting around saying, like, I'm too nerdy, like I just want to be able to say something that's smart but cool about like movies and culture and sports and stuff, then this is the right interview. Because that's what the book's about.
I'm excited.
Oh, it's an excellent conversation, and we were actually joined by all three authors in doing the interview, which is a rare. It's a scheduling feat that to succeed to have four people on at the same time. So you're going to hear from Juan, Stacey, and Mark. All three of them are professors, and Juan and Stacey are at Vanderbilt University Divinity School, and Mark is from up in Victoria at the University of Toronto. And so, that's a Canadian and then, two people in Tennessee.
Tennessee, there you go.
Just bringing them together to talk about culture. I know people are thinking, did you get to talk about August and everything after by Accounting Pros? No. Just want to tell you up front.
That's the premium content version.
No, yeah. But we did talk about the relationship of religion and culture. We talked about the religious nature of it. We talked about sports, maybe how awesome the Lakers are.
How am I not surprised?
I managed to get the Lakers in. We talked about reclaiming Marx, cultural criticism today. Talked about Robert Bella and Nina and Smart. Those are some theorists. We discussed, Zootopia.
I heard that was a good movie.
Yeah, that's what the people say.
Is that the one with the sloth taking forever to laugh at the joke?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that part seemed funny. I didn't see the rest of the movie.
The movie's great. Like it was excellent. So yeah, that's what we're going to talk about. Before we jump in the podcast, I just want to tell you a little secret. We've started doing a lot of different live video things on the Homebrewed Christianity Facebook page. So if you haven't liked Homebrewed Christianity on Facebook, then you should do it. And you can also click the follow button. There's a follow button.
It should be pretty easy to find.
And it will then tell you, like, oh, Homebrewed's doing a live video stream. And over there, we're going to be doing like Q&A things. I did one like when I have been visiting like book groups, people reading my book. I'll just put my talk on there and then do Q&A on there. We did the Why Go things, the Why Go insert a theologian's name webinar. They've been posted there, and we're going to keep coming up with new stuff. So I like it because it's live and interactive. And if it's live and interactive, then it justifies not editing afterwards.
That's right.
It's also a way to get kind of instant feedback.
Mm-hmm. All those little likes and hearts floating across the screen.
I know. When you see those hearts flying, you say, it just warms you up on the inside. So yeah, there we go. The other thing I was going to say is do that. And remember, this is the Homebrewed Christianity Podcast. We have relaunched kicking alive and kicking the Theology Nerd Podcast. So if you are not subscribed to that, then you're really missing out, because on the Theology Nerd Podcast, we go into different formats. They're not like interviews. Sometimes they're Q&A.
Much more diverse.
Sometimes they're like discussions between friends.
Community, HBC community events and
yeah. Like, so all the members to the Homebrewed community can get on there, send in topics, get in on a little Epiphanation, which was the event we did where we basically drank and answered questions for 3 hours on the internet on the day of Epiphany. So yeah, you want to make sure that you're following the Theology Nerd Podcast, and then if the lure is strong and you want to become a member of the Homebrewed community, then you can do that. Go to homebrewedcommunity.com. Then you can get yourself a ecclesiastical title. You'll donate some each month to support everything that the podcast is doing, and be a part of the secret Facebook group, our reading groups, discussion groups, interact online, and then get to submit like topics, questions, and even join live for some of the Q&A stuff. So yeah, think about doing that, and until next time.
The altars where we worship.
Yeah, the altars where we worship. We're gonna do some Altarization right now. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and today we're going to be talking about a brand new book, one that I'm sure you're going to be clicking halfway through this interview to go ahead and get. It is called The Altars Where We Worship, The Religious Significance of Pop Culture. And on the podcast, we have a religious investigation of pop culture trinity. All three authors of this text are on the podcast. We're going to be talking about it. And I said to myself, well, if they're just listening to this podcast and I'm getting to see all three faces, how can we make sure that you know who's talking when? So I'm going to let them each introduce themselves and say their name, like where they're teaching and stuff. And really, what was the last movie that made you cry? Like, what was a movie you were watching and you shed a little tear? Like, I would say, my name's Tripp. I teach at the Hatchery in Los Angeles. The last movie made Cry's Cars, and that's because I've watched it so many times with my son, who has ear infections a lot, that now anytime I see something from Cars, I think of holding a little baby with ear infections. And that scene at the end where lightning stops, goes back and pushes King across the line, and then his friends are there, and they're like, you could have won, but the cup's nothing without your friends. It's just an empty cup. And I'm like, ooh, because it's 2 a.m. and I'm holding my baby.
Wow.
So like Cars, like at this point, anytime something somewhat comes up next to Cars and friendship related, Tripp just starts tearing up. Anyway, so yeah.
Wow.
So who wants to go first? All right. Well, Mark, you're sitting at the top of my screen, Mark. So
How did I get there?
I don't know. That's just how the internet puts you. Right there at the top of the screen.
You must be the Father in the Trinity.
Oh,
there you go.
Well,
I'm just trying to think of recent movies I've seen.
Well, it doesn't have to be a movie, but just tell us your name, where you are, and stuff. But it said pop culture, so I thought religious significance of pop culture just means movies you cry at. It was
yeah. Well, it does when you aren't at the end of a term. You fit all your movies in during Christmas break. So I'm trying to think of Manchester by the Sea sometime next week. I hope that one might make me cry.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
tears in advance. Okay.
These are tears in advance.
Okay.
So I'm Mark Toulouse. I teach at Emmanuel College at the University of Toronto in Toronto, Ontario. I'm an historian of Christianity, but most of my career have been doing religion and public life, religion and culture, those kinds of things.
All right. So who's next? I don't want to decide who's the Son and who's the Spirit here.
I'm the Holy Spirit, so I'll go last.
I don't know. Depends on what part of which way you want to organize the Trinity. Okay. At Vanderbilt, Peter Hodgson gave the Spirit a bigger role than Jesus.
Well, the Spirit definitely has the biggest role because it has to deal with all the lunacy here on earth.
So, on that note, do you want to take it away, Stay?
My name is Stacey Floyd-Thomas, and I have the privilege of teaching ethics and society at Vanderbilt University, particularly in the Divinity School, as well as a graduate division of religion. My areas of expertise are at the intersections of liberationist ethics, liberation theology, womanist and feminist thought, and critical pedagogy. If I were to say the most recent movie that made me cry, it would definitely be Zootopia with my daughter. The way in which the subversive culture of the interlockings of race and gender work to sabotage the agency of people on the margins and our ways to survive. And the fact that children already have to negotiate that through fantasy and through fiction just really took my breath away. So, and my daughter's second grade womanist skepticism is following suit. I'll let you know years from now whether it's paid off.
Okay.
All right. You can't dodge anything now on. So
No, not ducking or dodging. I'm Juan Floyd-Thomas, and I'm associate professor of African American religious history at Vanderbilt Divinity School and the Graduate Department of Religion. And if I were to think about a recent, I'll say movie for the case of argument, a recent movie that made me tear up inexplicably, I teared up during a late night watching of The Revenant. Aside from just, the scene in the movie, the climactic scene where Leo DiCaprio is fighting a bear, just thinking about the level of loss that, and no spoiler alert here, the level of loss that he and the folks around him endured during that movie, it just took my breath away. So yeah, I would put it on The Revenant.
Mm-hmm. So I'm interested in where when it was in this project you decided on the title, The Altars Where We Worship, because there are so many different ways people frame religion and pop culture conversations, so many kind of different tactics. I think you could probably write a whole book just kind of like Christ in culture, Niebuhr's kind of typology, just for how people imagine engaging in kind of the religion and culture debate, except you all settle that a lot in the introduction and then engage in these different topics, be it big business, entertainment, politics, sports, sex and body, that type of thing, and do some really constructive engagement rather than just assessing what's there. But the title, it's striking. So when was it that The Altars Where We Worship popped on the agenda?
Before we wrote a word, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think Mark and Stacey, you've got that pegged. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, we, it goes back to 2006 probably when we really started conversations about religion and popular culture. And we talked about becoming participant observers or taking a look at it from the inside if we could. And as we talked about it, the word altars came up just in the conversation, thinking about, the values people have are formed by experience in ways they don't often talk about or critically look at. And one of the biggest problems in American religion these days is the big gap between expressed confession of religious identification and actual practice of religion. And the only way that we could think about it was that what we're talking about is worshiping at different altars than we actually profess. So I think the name just kind of popped out for us, The Altars Where We Worship, as what we were really interested in exploring. Is that right, Stacey?
I think so. We had come across in some different work that we were exploring actually as a faculty at Texas Christian University and Bright Divinity School, some Pew data that had stated that though the majority of Americans claim that they are religious, quote unquote, that they are participants and observers of institutionalized religion, the fact of the matter, though more than 80% make that claim, around 25 to 28% actually show up at any given sacred day of the week at those supposed houses of worship. And so following the Tillichian Paul Tillich's observation that which is sacred is that which we place our most ultimate concern, we asked ourselves, well, just exactly where are those people worshiping? Just exactly, we have this thing that we call, particularly within the Baptist tradition, when we don't see someone at church, they'll say, oh, I was at Bedside Baptist this morning. So we asked ourselves exactly where is that altar? Mm-hmm. Where is that sacred place where bodies and flesh and minds and money are invested on those supposed days where people are supposed to be worshiping in a more institutionalized fashion? What, so to speak, trumps that which they profess by that which they practice. Mm-hmm. And we realized that it was, in fact, these 6 altars that we name in the book, where people really do privilege and place that which is most ultimate and thereby the most sacred for them.
Mm-hmm. One of the things around conversation about pop culture is how a lot of the theories for studying religion or studying culture, the history we have to work with is one so tied to Christendom that we haven't really figured out how to investigate pop culture when it's becoming more and more detached from kind of the traditional symbolic structures of Judeo-Christian tradition in the West and that type of thing. But pop culture's emergence as a place that we attend to ritually with money, bodies, builds community and connections and things is something. And if you were thinking, who's the pioneers for recognizing it? It's marketing professionals. Okay. And they recognize it and create cultures around these interests so that you attend to them by investing your identity, your money, your time. And the church is kind of coming to grips with the fact that it's not the only narrative, in a sense, in town. Mm-hmm. How would that emerge? How do you understand that emergence of pop culture as this sphere of really like meaning making and engagement and an action? How do you see it and take it seriously?
Well, the bridge for us was, and I think you're right, marketers know more than anybody else when we're talking about secular society, what is meaning making. Mm-hmm. And so we were trying to figure out who was the best scholar of religion that has helped us understand that. And so Ninian Smart is probably the biggest pioneer within religious studies, and I would probably say secular religious studies, that was able to map out where it is within secular society that we find the sacred. And he says, even though people, and I guess we elaborate on what he's saying here, even though people might name something religious as that which is organized, if we look carefully at secular society, the same attributes of organized religion also exist in popular culture. Mm-hmm. For him, he maps out 7 particular, a 7-fold schema. And so he says that everything that is meaning making has a doctrine, has a myth, has an ethics at play, has ritual, has this notion of the experiential, has institutions, and last but not least, has a material culture of its own. And we use that 7-fold schema to then evaluate and to use as an overlay to find out how is it that we find the sacred in the secular, i.e. pop culture, wherein people invest most of what they consider valuable.
Can you name those 7 things again, just in case someone is, doing dishes and just said, "Oh, that was really helpful," or maybe and drop the footnote, and we'll link to it in the episode.
Doctrine, myth, ethics, ritual, experience, institutions, and material reality. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's Ninian Smart, the religious experience of mankind.
And you can also,
and I would say of humanity.
Well, he also refines this schema. He also refines this schema in a subsequent text called Worldviews. If folks wanted a shorter, but aside from our book, if they needed a shorter, kind of pithier approach to his schema.
Awesome.
But what I would also suggest, just as a way to kind of bring some of the chief concerns of our book into sharper focus, there's a quote that we actually kick off the book with from the pioneering religious scholar William James. Mm-hmm. And in his work on the varieties of religious experience, when he's contemplating the alleged crisis of religious pluralism on the one hand and fragmentation on the other, facing religiosity in his own day and time. And he's trying to attempt to discern how one ought to engage these processes on what we would call an objective as well as subjective basis. James writes, and I'm quoting here, We must therefore, from the experiential point of view, call these godless or quasi-godless creeds religions, quote unquote. And accordingly, when in our definition we speak of the individual's relation to what she or he considers the divine, we must interpret the term divine very broadly as denoting any object that is godlike, whether it be a concrete deity or not. And, with that, I end the quote. And that became fascinating for us, especially given what both Stacey and Mark were referring to about the kind of Pew data that's been, coming out, in recent years, constantly, pronouncing the decline or the disappearance of institutional religion. And I think what was fantastic about when we came together on this project and moving forward was the idea that we were very much not just reluctant, but I think in many regards refusing to accept that kind of woe is me kind of narrative about the state of contemporary religion. So rather than looking at it as a narrative of decline or demise, we're really trying to look at the issue of diversity and difference, which I think is something that really does resonate with a millennial generation of seekers and strivers, and especially, trying to reimagine and reconsider the worldview of the nuns. Because, just to put a kind of stamp on this, when you reach back into Tillich's kind of arguments, Paul Tillich, that is, as a pioneering theologian of culture, when he makes the argument that religion is the substance of culture and culture is the form of religion, right? These things aren't new. But the fact that the challenge, and I think you put it quite well, Tripp, the challenge to the established communities of faith that popular culture now presents is a new and some folks feel a very disruptive one. But folks have always tried to find that meaning-making option and opportunity in the things around them. So yeah, folks will attend Methodist service, or we'll go to shul, we'll go to the mosque, we'll go to the temple of their faith and of their choosing, but they'll also claim to be Dallas Cowboy fans or Tennessee Titan fans. They also will go to CrossFit. They'll pledge allegiance to Marvel Comics versus DC Comics, right? I mean, so folks find points of identification and meaning in a wide variety of things. Obviously we've seen this in our recent political elections, right? How we've become a half and half nation, or maybe just a 48, 46 nation, depending on who you ask. But anyway.
Well, one of the things that I'm interested in is how you came to the 6 different areas that you investigate, and even ordering them. Like, so you include chapter 1's body and sex, then big business, then entertainment, then politics and sports, then science and technology. And, I bet if you were just taking a survey of people about topics for religion and culture, most people wouldn't necessarily pick all of those or order them in that way. And yet, you begin with body and sex, which is a topic religious books tend to avoid like the plague. And if they talk about it, it's probably not the most exciting thing you've ever read, investigating the subject. And yet, one of the things I thought so powerful in the chapter is showing just how big of an influence the questions around body and sex shape our own material existence, the power dynamic at play in so many of our relationships, and that not taking that seriously when then engaging in something like religion and culture, you could end up with this kind of battle that's thoroughly Gnostic and disembodied and miss the way these ideas and unexamined kind of commitments we have shape people's lives.
The interesting thing about thinking these topics through and the ordering issue, on the one hand, we could say body and sex became the first chapter because we wanted Marilyn Monroe on the cover. We have Marilyn Monroe as the Statue of Liberty in that famous scene with the dress blowing up on the grate. Another way of looking at it, though, was when we sat down to think about the ordering of the chapters, we thought, okay, we could order them any number of ways, and we think through the philosophy of what would be best to order them first and last and in between. But we looked at it alphabetically, ironically, and we thought, this actually works, except for science and technology being the last, and we felt like it should be the last. So if we'd named it technology and science, it would have been the last alphabetically.
Okay.
But we, as we looked at these, everything kind of had in common understanding religion as an embodied experience. One of the major things that we recognize is people experience self-transcendence in a number of ways. But if they aren't experiencing self-transcendence in some way related to body and mind as a unified existence, kind of the old debate of Descartes versus Merleau-Ponty, where, the old Cartesian separation of body and spirit or body and soul. But Merleau-Ponty saying, no, what we're actually dealing with is there's one entity, one person that is both body and soul, the embodied nature of the experience of being human. And that's how you can begin to understand religion. And I think that when we saw body and sex as the chapter that really sets that out in interesting ways, it's important to use it first.
And to go to your point of marketing, the fact of the matter is sex sells. And if we were to look at the history of religion, we understand that even from an Augustinian perspective, and I would, even though we're talking about Christendom in that way, I would say that it deals with a lot of world religions. Augustine had this notion that it was the body that ensnared the spirit and the soul. And the body, of course, gets blamed on the woman, right? I mean, when we are to look at the Abrahamic understanding of the Garden of Eden and how sin enters into what was considered paradise, it was the man being lonely, the woman providing that company, and then her wanting to know more than what was considered good for her, causing the problem. She's then paired to vagina and womb, in pain, regulated, and then there, as feminists or womanists might say now, her role within society is objectified in as much as she can please and satisfy a man. When we were to look at the recent elections that we had, we realized that everything got pared down to body and sex. Whether it was the size of Trump's hands or the appearance of the women that he problematized, how Hillary Clinton dressed, who her husband slept with, or now the cosmetic appearance of the women that have made it into his cabinet. The fact of the matter is that majority of the population in America happens to be women. And the worst thing that a woman can be called is ugly. The worst curse word that exists within our society are curse words, or I might say almost within any language, are words that pare people down to vagina and womb. The worst thing that you can call a man has everything to do with a woman. So even though alphabetically it made sense, I just think that was providence. But I would still say that if we were to look at all of these altars, even if we were to talk about politics, even if we were going to talk about business, even if we were going to talk about the virtual reality of gaming or the speed of technology, so much of that is driven by bodily desire, is driven by wanting to present oneself as attractive or wanting to be able to be the trophy or have the trophy. And so much of that is about the anxiety that institutionalized religion, and that anxiety is about that silence or about that ensnaring or about how the body is always seen as sinful. So I think that's what we were trying to crack open, to say, although institutionalized religion shuns this is the yearning of most of society. what to do with this thing, what to do with this flesh and this embodied reality that encases the spirit or the soul.
If I could just follow up on what both Mark and Stacey have contributed, I'd also say that it seemed now, especially in hindsight, and Kierkegaard says, things are best understood in backwards. Unfortunately, you have to live life forwards, right? The idea that by starting with body and sex, right, we had this situation where you start from the most tangible, concrete, immediate source of being. And then as we progress through the remaining chapters, we're moving ever forward towards more increasingly intangible or ephemeral or ideational manifestations of human existence, of human concerns, and up to and including science and technology being that final frontier, if you want to go into Star Trek mode, right? But this idea that starting with the body and echoing what Mark was saying about Merleau-Ponty, right, is through the body that we experience the world. It's through the body that we have knowledge and presence in the world. So that seemed most logical. But then to keep stacking our notion of the human condition in such a way so that through big business and economics, right? How do we, even though, interestingly enough, notion of economy starts with, kind of divine notions, from Tertullian and others, divine notions of economic exchange and reality that became secularized. When you think about, the core source of original entertainment and diversions and escapism, right? Whether it's reading the Bible or other holy texts as an entertainment or as means of exercising the imagination, and then suddenly that became secularized. And it goes on and on through politics and through sports and ultimately through science and technology. Right? This idea of this kind of shift from the sacred to the secular, but not so much in terms of it simply being one-sided, because I think that's where a number of existing texts on religion and culture have oftentimes cast their lot, totally in seeing this as, pop culture stole our mojo. Pop culture robbed us of our authority, whereas I would argue our book is seeing this as a healthy dose of kind of mutual borrowing and kind of forgive me for this, but a kind of fluidity, if you will, where there's a continuous back and forth. It's not just all one-sided.
Well, one of the things that I think might be helpful is to pick one of the chapters, but kind of lay out how you see the 7 different kind of elements that Smart highlights playing out, because the order in each chapter is not always the same, like which ones you look at first. But by the time you get done with a chapter, you're like, oh, well, I could imagine my thoughts including half of what was said in the chapter, but unless I was forcing it through this grid to think about it, certain connections and elements wouldn't be there. So I mean, I don't know which one is the one y'all are most excited about, or which one looks most tempting to run through the seven parts. But yeah, I'll totally take your follow y'all's lead. But if you are thinking about getting the book, one of the most helpful elements is that each chapter is a constructive one on its own, but also you start to see connections across the investigation when you take the time to kind of look at all 7 elements. And so the persuasiveness of the larger argument, I think, builds cumulatively.
Wow.
Is there a chapter you have a preference for, Tripp? I mean, we're kind of excited about all of them. So,
well, I'm an avid priest in the religion of Lakers as a LA native. I subscribe and have the very particular company for internet and cable TV so that I have a 24-hour, 7 days a week, 365 days a year access point to Laker mythology. My son is named Elgin.
Okay.
For Christmas, we're going to a father and son outing to go to the Lakers game. And engage in pre and post ritual experience. I am unnecessarily affected emotionally by the sheer failure of the last two seasons. My year is brighter because this year the Lakers are doing better. We have a young core that's building. The arrival of Luke Walton was kind of a proleptic moment for Tripp as a Laker fan. And when the last time we did win the title, I re-listened to a radio recording every day for like a week and a half. So if I'm picking that one just because confessionally, my relationship to the Lakers is inappropriate. And I don't know if they hand out ordination certificates, but I could get one.
You got to ask Jack Nicholson on that one.
He's the Pope.
Well, Mark would definitely be a fellow disciple along with you. So we'll let Mark handle sports.
I'm not a disciple of the Lakers, though. But, I think the first thing to say about looking at these categories through a brief lens like this would be to say that each of these categories, some of them more than others within a chapter, are a bit more complex than we could make clear in a few comments that would be summary comments. But, you look at myth. You can start with myth in a number of ways, right? In sport, you can talk about the myths associated with the trade of Babe Ruth and what that meant to Boston and its chances for a World Series and how that myth lived so long. And then you can talk about Billy the Goat and Chicago and how that actually fell this year after the book was published. We did put a note in that it might fall this year, actually. But I think what we're talking about in terms of myth is a bit broader than a lot of the things you can use as myth in sports. And the power that's associated in sport with the power of male athletes and athletics. There's a strong gender bias in sports that's been a part of the mythology of sports forever, even though we've had some great women athletes. But it's just harder for women athletes than it is for men athletes. And so I think looking at the power of myth in sports as it affects gender and relationship of gender is important. But I think also you can go back to the myth that sport actually builds nobility of character. The idea or mythology that if you're involved in sport, you're actually going to have your character built in some significant way. You're a better person for it. Many people talk about baseball because baseball is a sport without a clock. And, life is got a clock, but life runs more like the rhythm of baseball innings than it does according to a clock. And so some people talk about how baseball embodies the virtues of a freedom to become whatever you can become or whatever you will be within a context that's limited enough to keep the whole world around you from succumbing to chaos. And in some ways, sport does do that. And baseball particularly, you live within this context or framework. And there's a mythology that says, that's how we live our lives. And that's why for many baseball became the American pastime. But what we've discovered in our look at it is that usually sports mirrors whatever's happening in the American culture. And so therefore, sometimes it's the best in American culture. But as we've seen with many recent events and domestic abuse in football and various other things, sometimes sports mirrors the worst in American culture. There's also the myth of the level playing field in sports, that somehow everybody who enters in level playing field. But the truth is that wealth plays a very dramatic role in possibilities of success in sports. What kind of wealth you had in the home you grew up in, what kind of opportunities. Also racism in sports and how it operates and how certain sports become more accessible to, say, African Americans than other sports for a variety of reasons. And oftentimes wealth plays a role in that. Then when you look at doctrine, there are a lot of doctrines you could pick up, and things like there's always next year, or the importance of self-confidence to success, or hard work always has to accompany the ability to succeed. Whatever natural ability you have to have the hard work to go with it. You look at Derek Jeter in his kind of exit interview. He talked about how important self-confidence was to his success. There are these doctrines that kind of play a role. You look at rituals. We have all kinds of rituals you could pick out, and many of them are kind of funny. Michael Jordan always wore his college shorts under his professional uniform. Wade Boggs always ate chicken, some form of chicken, before playing every game. There are also fan rituals, team rituals. If you're a fan who gathers before the game with the barbecue and all this, sometimes during the game with a big screen TV out in the parking lot instead of actually witnessing the game inside the stadium. There are all kinds of rituals. The whole ritual behind the Olympic torch and how that started in Germany, by the way, in the German athletics, and what it represented becomes, it's one thing when it starts, it's another thing later. The rituals of doing the Star-Spangled Banner, and then after 9/11, adding God Bless America during the seventh inning. I mean, these are all rituals that have meaning, are tied to wanting a particular result or connecting the game in a particular way to certain kinds of forms of meaning. Ethics, Stacey and I talked a lot about this with Juan, about, how ethics in sport tends to be deontological. The major question for ethics in sport is, does the action that you're contemplating or completing fall within the confines that are defined by some set of rules or not? And what's more important is, did you act within the rule? That's more important than the consequence. And this is the way a lot of people live their lives. Well, what I did was legal. What I did was within the rule. Like, we heard that a lot during the campaign, actually, in some of the debates. Trump would say, what I did was within the law. If you didn't like it, change the law. There's no consideration of consequence. It's deontological. Was it legal or not? So if you hit the quarterback and you do it in a way that's legal, even if it results in head injury or neck or spine injury, that's unfortunate, but it's not unethical because it was within the law. It's not cheating if the action can be construed as within the rules. And if there is no rule, then you aren't breaking one. So you can explore any new frontier in baseball you want to explore as long as you're not breaking an existing rule. And then they come up with new rules. I remember Lenny Randall trying to blow a ball, a slow rolling grounder, trying to blow it out of bounds before it got to the bag so that it could be an out of bounds instead of a base hit. And they came up with a rule about that. But it wasn't against the rules when he did it. So then you move to experience. I think the one thing that was most clear to me in sports was this embodiment of spirituality that does in some manner get lived out in sport. The athletic focus of performance. When somehow an athlete feels, male or female, that the body and soul are one in the moment of the experience of performing at your best. I mean, all of us amateur athletes have had that happen in our lives at one point or another, when something happened on the field of play that just gave us this experience of transcendence, an ecstasy of accomplishment that kind of put body and spirit together in some meaningful, embodied way. But there's also the experience of being a part of a community like you are with the Laker community. It's your community of belonging. It's a place where you find emotional unity. When something happens with the Lakers, every Laker fan has this kind of joint experience. My son Joshua, he was born in Chicago, and even though he was 6 or 7 when we left, he's never forgotten Chicago. It's in his bones. So every Chicago team is his team. So he made a trip to Chicago, even though he couldn't afford the series tickets. He spent the whole time the series was in Chicago in a bar right there in Wrigley World. And he was living a transcendent experience in those bars with every fan who was present. And it was otherworldly for him. It was self-transcendent. It was an ability to experience something with his community of belonging that comes along once in 100 years for the Cubs, right? So it's this world of lived experience that really made a difference. And finally, you look at institutions. Well, you got professional leagues, you got the ballparks, you got the halls of fame, you got many things you could pick. Materiality, you've got the whole world of sports memorabilia, the artifacts of any sport. Who's got what jersey? You know, it'd be great to have so-and-so's jersey hanging on my wall. And somehow I feel a part of the experience of that player. And it's my credential into the world of belonging. So those are just some very brief, random, quick examples of sport.
Well, I want to lean in here and just make sure, Trip, that you and the audience understand that it's not just the altar that you worship as an avid sports fan or even a Laker. That also has to do with your normative gaze of how you see the world, how you read other people and other bodies. So, for instance, as an ethicist, when I look at sports, I totally see the way in which one's virtue, one's value, one's worth is seen based on the sport they play or how well they play the sport or the body that they have and what that suggests about the sport they ought to play. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we as womanists I always say, and many of my womanist students have picked up, is when we look at the terrain or the altar of sports, the bigger the ball, the better. I mean, the smaller the ball, supposedly the better the man. So that's a class and race analysis of a class, race, and gender analysis of sports. When we talk about sports, we're just talking about men. Mm-hmm. I mean, clearly. And to the extent that any woman can play a sport, she gets masculinized. We see that with Serena Williams, just as an example, or the WNBA players, just as an example. But if we were to do a class read of this, while there is an American assumption that reads Black males as being athletically gifted or endowed, when Tiger Woods crosses that class threshold of golf, all of a sudden, right, there's a frenzy. What is a Black man doing on a master course? So much so that, racist critiques are thrown at him. A new design has to be made of many of the master courses. For instance, we realize that you can literally buy the size of a ball of the sport, look at class and race, from polo to golf to tennis. The problem that we have with the Williams sisters, right? Or even Arthur Ashe. I mean, we can even go back in time. We realize it's because Black bodies shouldn't hit tennis balls, right? While the bigger the ball, whether we're talking about basketball or football, we expect Black bodies to be there. Mm-hmm. And the only virtue a Black man can have in much of American society from a normative gaze is his ability to play a sport. We read women's bodies the same way. A woman can play well tennis or basketball, but the money that they're able to amass because of that has everything to do with their female body. My husband, as a college student, was a National Merit Scholar, went to an Ivy League institution, got his PhD, 6'4", 200 and plus pounds. When people see his body, even though his title is Dr. Juan Floyd-Thomas, the fact of the matter is people experience cognitive dissonance when he says he does not play a sport. It's as if he is lying. It's as if his body is a waste because a Black man should not have a mind, right? He should only have a body. I'm from Texas, and, that's sports territory.
Oh, yeah.
If you're a Texan and you do not play a sport, you become the shame of your family. It's just expected. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just the significance of sports for sports enthusiasts. It's the way in which that becomes part of the civil religion of America and the gaze through which we read the virtue that we organize and place the bodies and the value of those bodies among the American landscape.
Also, sorry, Tripp. Also, I think this is a good time to talk about the whole notion of the avatar as a kind of gateway into each of the chapters, because especially in Stacey and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think with sports, we had probably the most, I'll say most fruitful debate or conversation about the avatar for that chapter. But for each one, for body and sex, for big business, for entertainment, sports, politics, science and technology, to try to drill down and find one kind of iconic figure, one person who in their essence, both in terms of their life as well as their legacy, that they embody, that they emulate the kind of core principles and premises of each one of these altars was a weighty task. And so when you think about somebody like Jackie Robinson, who we ultimately chose as the avatar for sports, part of the argument was, what else can you say about Jackie Robinson? Because at the time, there had been the Ken Burns kind of loving homage to him. There had been the recent movie 42 about Robinson, But when we took the time to, just change the focus ever so slightly, right? And Calvin talks about revelation is like putting on new spectacles, right? Right. Mm-hmm. This notion that just trying to look at Robinson's life and career and his social impact through the lens of religion opened up for us at least a new portal, a new way of getting at some deeper and more substantial truths. And I think that becomes an interesting concern, right? This pairing of avatar to altar. And I think that, especially now when you think about how Mark was, I think, perfectly on point about talking about how certain levels of social ethics have now gone painfully and woefully awry in our society, where I'm led to think about Chief Justice Earl Warren, who, when asked, what part of the newspaper did he look at the start of his day, he said he liked to go directly to the sports section because he'd rather read about humanity's accomplishments rather than their misdeeds, right? Well, nowadays, unfortunately, more conversation about athletics is rife with the problems of people and the downfall of certain levels of discipline and doctrinal belief. But also thinking about this too, like there was a time, maybe within the last generation where you started to see a shift where the reality of folks, right, who used to laud Wrigley Field or Fenway Park or, once upon a time, Shea Stadium, right? These kind of hallowed temples of athletic excellence. And now you think about some of the more dominant and explosive sports in our nation, right? MMA, through the UFC, the WWE, which, from my vantage point, don't have the same kind of numinous quality. If you borrow that phrase from Rudolph Otto, right? You don't get the same idea of the holy, when you're seeing MMA fighters going to town on each other. And I wrestle with that. Is that the world of sport speaking to our society and culture? Is our society and culture demanding that sport look and feel a different way?
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you look at when those kind of combat sports become popular, mm-hmm. it's when the other sports decided to regulate a number of things. Like baseball used to be fun because they were on steroids and they hit home runs.
Okay.
I want to be like, can we just vote Like I would rather have 70 home runs all the time. I watch more baseball. Now takes forever. There's hardly any scoring. And a really good game is one where the pitcher stays in a long time and doesn't get hit. Okay. And you're like, or even like the growth of soccer, for example, soccer it's a set beginning and ending time. There's not lots of interruptions. So you as the fan get fully invested in it. I thought soccer was boring growing up. I didn't want to play it. I mean, I did because friends were on the team, but I would much rather have played basketball and baseball. That's why I played all the time. And so like, but, let's get HGH out and there's less homers. It's boring. Well, that's not what an MMA thing is. Like an MMA, like you see an explosion of bodies.
Literally,
yeah. And what happens with the NFL starts growing in popularity because that's a place that you have that. And then people start trying to regulate it around the concussions and all that kind of thing. See, I feel like if they just let baseball players take the drugs and let the NFL not take them, then we'd have less concussions because you'd only have 300-pound linemen, not 400-pound linemen. Okay. But like, I don't know. That's when you said that, I thought, yeah, there's a sense that you see a shift in the alignment of sports and millennials being connected to MMA and also the NBA significantly more. You have like the individuals are the story, not the team. For example, like the NBA is shaped by what used to be employees becoming the most dominant and influential factors in the NBA. Like LeBron James should win like general manager of the year along with MVP because that creation of a super team is them going, we're not having our labor exploited and then stuck playing somewhere we don't want to play with, people we don't want to play with. Some mediocre coach is going to try to tell me what to do when I own this junk. And I've turned myself into a brand. I have a platform for getting and engaging people that follow me. So like the NBA and MMA are both sports where the athlete has also become an entrepreneur. The MMA, it's individuals make as much money on publicity as the league does. And the NBA's biggest, the biggest figures make more from their brand management, shoes and all that kind of thing than they do in the league. So they'll take pay cuts to be on a team that wins because your income goes up if you're playing in June rather than, going out in another area. I think that whole nostalgia that we have around sports of like, in the good old days. And like, if it's hard, really misses just how much, sports is showing us how our religious identities have shifted. Sports has moved away from, these kind of nostalgic, historic expectations on people. The ones that are growing and stuff are the ones where individuals in it, realize they themselves are the brand and, relate to it that way.
But Tripp, I would dare argue, isn't that same phenomenon happening within the world of religion, right? Oh, yeah. It's the charismatic churches. It's the churches that are engaged in these kind of neo-Pentecostal, if we think about this in Christian terms, but even if you operate in a more expansive way, right? You think about the growth of faith traditions like Islam or what have you, right? It's the most individualistic, most immediate, most intense expressions of those traditions that is finding fertile ground. But to this point, I think what we lose sight of, I think sports is a perfect arena for this conversation, is that too often, especially from the theological or the larger academic purview, folks want to dismiss the symbolic and say, it's just symbols, right? No, symbols matter. Symbols have power. They have resonance, right? When folks can't get to the substance, they depend upon and in fact demand the symbol be in place, right? Nowadays through the language of marketing, we refer to this as branding or what have you. But, just looking in the realm of sports, right? When you have the kind of triumph of the underdog against insurmountable odds. We saw this with the recent World Series, right? The idea that, Cleveland versus Chicago, especially the Cubs, right, was an important battle because, you had the fate of these two sports franchises, these two teams who were embodying as Mark was saying earlier, the hopes and desires of countless generations of fans, right? It wasn't just about the teams, although the teams and the players on those teams mattered, but they embodied something greater than themselves, right? When you think about, some of the recent controversies surrounding Colin Kaepernick and the 49ers by extension, right? The fact that, he's ready, willing, and able to take a knee in a mode of protest, at the playing of the national anthem at the beginning of a game, right, took on greater impact than the actual gameplay of the 49ers on any given Sunday, right? Mm-hmm. You think about, recently we lost Muhammad Ali, and thinking about, the idea, the impact that he had, not just in the sporting arena, not just in a boxing ring, but also in the larger world of culture and politics, right? And in fact, it was the time that he wasn't boxing that he became, as folks affectionately referred to him, the people's champ, right? So anyway, I would just make that case that, and maybe this is one of the hopefully the major thrusts of our book, is that I think folks have been too quick to dismiss the symbolic as simply being, disposable or simply being something that it's the stuff that kids get fascinated by. But if you're serious and, studied, we have to look for something else.
And it's because people have separated symbol from body, symbols from reality. The fact of the matter, the reason why sports is so heavily male, from my perspective, is that sports, of course, is palpable. And that's why people writ large identify with it. But sports is the only public display of male community where men can feel and be felt that exist. So the only public presentation of intimacy that men are allowed to have in an acceptable way in America is through sports. So you have men touching and being felt, from aggression to skill, and always a mix of the two, while the men watching them can have a virtual reality of being part of that community. That is part of what Kaepernick disrupts, and that is part of what gets disrupted on any given Super Bowl Sunday, where I don't believe so, ironically, that's the one day where domestic violence is at its height. Why? Because women enter into a space that is predominantly male for men, and that is so palpable experientially and physically in a way that they're not otherwise able to have it. And so what we're trying to do in our work is to look at symbols, but also look at that which is considered not symbolic in the everyday, to show something poignant and profound about reflecting on sacrality in our secular reality.
I think the point is you can look at this more broadly. If you back up, what we're trying to say is everyone assumes there's this big gap between the sacred and the secular. And I think what we're saying is there's a line in our book where we say there's a new sacred in town. And really, there's just not a clear delineation between what is secular and what is sacred. In fact, the things we determine to be secular, like sports or body and sex or business or any of these other categories, in fact, are acting in very religious ways. And people are actually claiming their meaning in life from the way these so-called secular realities affect their lives. And we tend to flip our understanding of traditional religion. We have always tended to think about, in Christianity, the God who calls us to something beyond ourselves. But in essence, this new sacred is thinking instead about wanting a God that meets our needs. We want a friendly God, a serviceable God, a God who provides us with some great service or fulfills our deepest desires and gives us meaning. So we say on the one hand that we are going to serve the things in our lives that are sacred, but in fact, we deem as sacred the things that end up serving us. So I think Americans are approaching religion these days, even though they might be really good Methodists or Baptists or any other Protestant or Catholic or Buddhist or Muslim or any religious group, we're approaching religion these days as if it's a large salad bar. And part of the ingredient we put into our bowl may be our mosque or our local congregation, but we're also putting a lot of other goodies, and we're picking and choosing from this huge salad bar and mixing it into our salad of religion. And a lot of what goes into that is historically considered to be secular, but is actually not secular at all. It becomes sacred in the way we understand it, in the way it shapes and forms us, in the way we find meaning in it, and in fact, in the way we now understand the world. And if we're shaped and formed by the values associated with these so-called secular things, they're not secular anymore. They've actually become religious in a way that is shaping us as human beings, giving us a worldview. It may be a worldview that actually conflicts with what we're hearing in our own religious communities, but in many ways, our religious communities become what we are shaped by outside of them and what we bring into them. And I think that's one of the things that's happening to traditional religions.
Mm-hmm. But what really troubles the water in our text, and I think the millennial generation is showing us this in some ways, or within Christian terminology, prosperity gospel is showing us this in some ways, that the God we serve is oftentimes a God that serves us. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what's the implications of that for those of us who do consider ourselves religious? Mm-hmm. What's the implication of only being able to worship that which we immediately desire?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think just picking up on what Stacey was talking about, within each chapter, obviously mythology is a important piece, but to my mind, I think about in the entertainment chapter where we talk about a sort of dualism between how within popular culture you seen the emergence of the superhero kind of motif, especially in our movie theater experiences, versus on television the dominance of the anti-hero. Mm-hmm. Right? So you go to a movie theater. Nowadays you can see Doctor Strange, you can see, Captain America, Batman versus Superman if you really want to. At home, you're watching Breaking Bad, or you're watching Mad Men or The Sopranos, or whatever your peak TV of choice is right now, House of Cards, what have you. But at the core, right, this notion of the heroic, right, of the person who will save us, who will save the day, right? This goes back to what Mark was saying a few moments ago about the serviceable God, right? Somehow, rescue us, rescue me. But at no point, at least in this kind of passive engagement with popular culture, is this imagining that we can save ourselves, or that we are the, to borrow this kind of Gandhian perspective, that we are the ones, we are the hope that we've been looking for, right? That at some point within our society, once again, right, this notion that either the hero is messianic and it has to be valorized, has to be, pedestalized, or as we say, especially towards the end of the book, altarized, or there are no heroes, right? Nobody's perfect. Nobody's good. Nobody's, redeemable, right? Since we're all, filled with perfect imperfections, right? Why should I look to anyone for anything better or greater? And I think that the culture writ large is challenging us in those ways to try to seek out what does it truly mean to be human in the 21st century at this stage of our condition, at this stage of our experience. And you can see that narrative, that concern, I think, driving throughout all 6 chapters that we offer here.
Well, I know one of the things that, and Tillich pointed this out, and I think y'all do a good job highlighting it, that a lot of times we're asking questions that we don't know we're asking because we're like, oh, well, that's just sports, or that's comic book movies. I always wanted them to act them out. Now they get to, and it's so much cooler than just reading the paper or whatever. We don't realize how much of our energy as humans is spent asking what it means to be human. And one of the things I think comes up throughout the book is how we have yet to kind of come to grips or acknowledge the role economy and class play in this conversation. And it shows up in multiple places of the chapter, and there's obviously a chapter on big business. But as you take a step back and think about the questions that culture are wrestling with of what it means to be human, and that the framework for asking those questions is less a single sacred canopy of Christendom, but an explosion of narratives and symbols that are unexaminedly sacred and really profit-driven. How do you describe the role the economy is playing in this the new sacred that's in town?
Well, I think Trump is a great example of this, and our many multi-billionaires cabinet and all of these things. The understanding of the kind of view that markets ought to have free reign in the world. And if only we can let the markets have free reign, the markets become the invisible hand of God. And if we can unhinge the markets from the control of any government, they're going to do the right thing by people. Mm-hmm. I think we had that in trickle-down economics with Ronald Reagan, but I don't think we ever had it quite to the extent that we've got it with Donald Trump or with many in the right end of the Republican Party. So I think Ayn Rand's approach to economics is kind of really taking control and to look at the comparison between, say, the old Christian understanding of class, where Jesus would say in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor, it's better to be a servant than a master. These kinds of upside down understandings of what it means to serve others is how you gain significance in your life, to where Ayn Rand would say, instead of blessed are the poor, something like, damn the moochers. Mm-hmm. It's just a different way of looking at life. And our economics today, I think, is less concerned about people and more concerned about the free reign of economics, the free reign of the dollar, the free movement of money, the ability for a person to get as much of it as a person can get. What's more important is the accumulation of success, and greed becomes more important than people. Profits is more important than people. And so there's this, even amongst us at whatever level in all classes, we tend to become consumers. And even when it's not in our best interest to become consumers, we are formed in such a way that consumption is more important than many other things we might understand about ourselves or about others. So, Juan, I don't know, you had a major hand in thinking through the issues of economics for us, and I think dealing with Marx in this chapter at the end was really an important way to say that it might be time to rethink Marx. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think on several points, what we've been talking about here in terms of the challenges that American society currently faces, but I think historically has grappled with in terms of how do we talk about economics and more immediately class as a culture, as a society matters, especially within the field of religion and theology. Typically, perennially, religion and theology has been very let me try to say this as politely as possible, has been very scant, very weak in its ability to talk about issues of socioeconomic class in any kind of coherent and cohesive way. Yeah, there have been a few scholars who've tried to do so, but en masse, whether it's been an issue of either a lack of comfort and confidence in being able to talk to and about economic factors and realities, or just simply the notion that it was impolite or out of sorts, somehow crude and cruel to talk about economics within the realm of spirituality and faith. Whatever the case may be, I think now, especially in a 21st century context, there needs to be a more rigorous and robust way of approaching the conversation about economic class, political economy, if you will. So when Mark makes reference to Ayn Rand, the idea that you will have, especially at least an older or more intellectually and ideologically defined set of conservatives who would quote Ayn Rand chapter and verse, even though Ayn Rand herself was an atheist, right? So, you would have folks like now Vice President-elect Mike Pence, who would subscribe to a Randian vision of economic worldview, but would reject her, for her atheism, right? That the amount of contradiction or paradox that piles itself on high is fascinating to me. The idea that within the doctrine of laissez-faire, as we talk about within the chapter, the idea that folks, would pour millions, if not billions of dollars into the stock market, right? Even on today, the stock market is approaching unprecedented heights, in terms of almost, by the time of this recording, hitting close to 20,000 on the Dow. Folks ascribing more confidence and faith in the market than they do in many worship services or theological perspectives that they arguably are identified or ascribed to. Conspicuous consumption as a kind of ritual wherein folks shop till they drop, especially during this time of year, the holiday season, when when you're celebrating the life of one who lived his existence in poverty and amidst the dispossessed masses, to buy the next best flat screen TV or the latest greatest digital gadget or what have you, it seems to be a kind of inconsistent expression of our adherence to our best principles. And so when Mark makes reference to Marx, Karl Marx, that is, Marx had his problems, in terms of his kind of expression and experience with religion. As many of us, right, have to wrestle with the world as we found it upon our arrival, and then try to leave it better upon our inevitable departure. But the idea that I think Marx has been least served, worst served, not just by his critics, but ultimately by many of his advocates or biggest fans. So oftentimes when, that classic quote from Marx gets trotted out that, religion is the opium of the masses, very often that's used as a kind of cudgel, as a kind of naughty stick to whack against anybody who wants to talk about structural economic injustice, about why in the world we have folks who are designated as the least of these, right? The folks that, Jesus and various forms of the gospel challenges us to take care of, in the Matthean text, right? Have we fed the hungry? Have we clothed the naked? Have we given shelter to those who were dispossessed, right? Well, here we go. When Marx makes that classic statement about religion as the opium of the masses, a little bit further down, the part that usually falls off the ellipsis in that quote is he talks about religion as the heart of a heartless world. Mm-hmm. And that's a form of social critique and social concern that many theologians and religionists can get on board with, right? The idea that it is through our faith, it is through the building of meaning and community, especially around, all right, the haves and the have-nots, but also to the point about greed, that the haves and the have-lots, right? The folks who have and have more than any human being should ever have on the face of the planet, right? And that's what we're grappling with now. That was, I think, if there was any enduring gift of the Bernie Sanders campaign, if there was any enduring gift of the Occupy movement, if there has been any kind of enduring and a resounding gift of the labor movement in our society, or the abolitionist and anti-slavery movement in our society, or if the criticisms of feminism from feminists who wanted to demand equal work for equal pay, right? I mean, if there's any resonant value in all those cries for economic justice, it has to be this idea that we are best able to understand and appreciate the humanity of each other when folks don't have to beg for their daily bread. Mm-hmm. They don't have to wonder, will my child live in a world that's worse than the one I grew up in, or the ones in which my parents grew up in. And I think if we don't address those serious material realities and not think of it as, meddling in the mundane, right? As some folks would refer to this notion of being so heavenly bound that there are no earthly good, right? We are called, in every world tradition, in every world religion that I'm aware of, right? There's a notion of restorative justice, right? Within the Hebrew Bible, right? The notion of jubilee and the restoration and reciprocal balancing of relationships between masters and servants is there, right? Mm-hmm. One of the 5 pillars of Islam, zakat, right? The giving of alms to the poor and the guaranteeing that, even if you're less fortunate or less advantaged within the world of Islam, right? That the notion that you too should not have to suffer and struggle so much for that which has been given to each and all of us, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, and then obviously within Buddhism, right? Just the renunciation and rejection of greed and materialism, right? I mean, so many of the world traditions, when we look at them truthfully and hopefully, they inspire and seek out the best in us, not unfortunately what we've been seeing more of, the worst of us.
One of the things that you highlight in that section in the business class, the big business chapter, is how Marx today kind of asks a question of theodicy towards the market. Like, why are there a few people living it up while many of the poor work so hard, they suffer, and they do so sharing the same religion in a sense, mm-hmm. of the 1%.
Yeah.
That our kind of belief in these, you talk about rag to riches narratives or the conspicuous consumption ideals, mean that market-driven religion has, in a sense, done for the working class today what pie in the sky preaching did in the past. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an important critique to say, and also realize, like, that other half of the Marx line means that these historic wisdom traditions and religious traditions mm-hmm. Actually have the ability to have a symbolic communication, to claim and ask for allegiance from people that demand fidelity over against these other religions when we start to see just how religious our secular living is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I think you're right. And also this idea that when we wrestle with this notion of charity, let's just think about that in its notion. Yes, especially, coming from a Christocentric perspective, right? We are compelled and challenged to live lives that are defined by hope, faith, and charity. And charity, being also reinscribed as love, right? But this idea that if you think about some of the worst recent forms of devastation and disaster that have befallen us, both in the United States and globally, you think about the September 11th terror attacks. You think about Hurricane Katrina. You think about the Haitian earthquake or tsunamis that struck internationally, right? And you think about global crises in terms of famine or the delivery of potable, drinkable water, right? It's important that folks give through private charity and donation to these causes, and that's perfectly well and good. But if charity is the only way that folks are going to somehow survive the tragedies and travails of natural disasters or wars or disease and things of that sort, right? Then what we're witnessing is the failure of what Robert Bellah and others would call the good society. We're witnessing the collapse of something known as the common good or the commonwealth, right? Because the idea that we do have these organizations, and I'm not just talking about faith communities or charitable foundations and organizations, but we do have these entities known as the state, right? National government, right? Who also represent these kind of transcendent communities and are supposed to do for people that which they cannot do for themselves. And we talk about this at great length in the politics chapter.
Well, I think you can actually, one thing that Marx does that I think is really helpful here is he looks at things dialectically.
Sure.
And he talks about the absolute necessity of recognizing the conflict that exists. You have the people who control the means of production, and then you have the people who do the producing. Mm-hmm. And something has to be worked out between these differences that creates a new thesis. Mm-hmm. A new synthesis that brings some kind of good or some kind of a result that's different than what exists. And I think that the problem we have today, and it actually propelled Trump to a victory because he often said it so eloquently, but I've seen no evidence of doing anything that benefits the people who heard his message. He talked constantly about the people who've been forgotten, the people at the bottom of the rung of the ladder who have nothing. And he talked about the elites in Washington and draining the swamp and all these images that were so compelling to people who said, I've gotten the raw end of the deal for a long time. Mm-hmm. And it's, of course, he's appealing to all the racism in the society and thinking, gosh, things were better in the 50s when everything was a value in the society that I took for granted, the white male Protestant values of the society I wish we had today. There was a lot of that, but there was also the kind of appeal to a class that seemed to be forgotten, people who really felt like that they've been doing a lot of the work and aren't getting any of the benefit. And I think how we as a culture deal with trying to resolve what it means to be in a 99% with no power. And how do we get some of the power back? And I honestly think if something is not done, the pressure valve is going to break at some point. And there are going to be some things happening in our streets that are already beginning to happen in the U.S. that are going to demand change. And how we address that. And it's a powerful embodied experience at the very poorest levels of American society in gender and class that we're not paying enough attention to in the society. And you've got the whole movement of Black Lives Matter that most Americans do not understand. And that's a real judgment on American life, that we just simply don't understand that. Somehow we have to understand what's going on in a way that's going to make a difference. And if we don't, then I think, ultimately there'll be consequences and some kind of resolution in the dialectic that we may not imagine exactly how it's going to happen or understand fully what it means.
But if I could
go ahead.
Okay, if I could just piggyback on this notion of the dialectic. What ultimately happens in, especially contemporary terms, in talking about the economy, we create, even first and foremost, what becomes interesting is the way in which, somebody like Marx has been co-opted in a hyper capitalist society and culture like the United States, obviously never given full credit, but also more importantly, used against himself and against his greater and most resonant arguments. So, for instance, the kind of dialectic that Marx once upon a time used to talk about workers versus capital, right, now is articulated, especially by conservatives and the Republican Party, as winners versus losers, makers versus takers, right? The folks who have jobs versus, the jobless, right? The idea that the useful and the useless, right? I mean, that's the kind of dialectic, unfortunately, that's now become common sense within our society and culture. Also attached to that, and we've seen this more recently, is that the promise of Trump to bring back jobs, manufacturing jobs, good paying jobs that have gone overseas and have been chasing, corporations have been chasing after foreign labor markets that would allow them to increase their output, but also avoid having to pay minimum wages and other kind of benefits and so forth. Well, the notion that that's all just a function of globalization is, once again, it's a fiction, because we also have to look at this idea of automation and digitization, right? The idea that technology is now coming in and guaranteeing, for instance, the idea that America is becoming a jobless economy. And what I mean by that is the idea that, robots and computers that are now able to do the work that once, hundreds, if not thousands of human beings had to do, tasks that once upon a time were dependent on human labor, now, not so much. And rather than saying, okay, how do we think about an American society, and I think about this, in terms of, all right, how do we seek the best possibilities for the human condition that allow not just for work that is dignified, work that is meaningful, work that's more than just a paycheck, but actually contributes to yourself, to those you love, and to the world around you. But then also in reality, and these are the kind of tones where Marx is very, very much eschatological, is very much, tapping into the kind of messianic kind of concerns that our faith traditions uphold, is how can we afford, and I mean this quite literally, how can we afford to guarantee that now that we have an economy, we have a means by which, think about this in terms of American society, where we are literally the most prosperous and productive nation that the world has ever seen. How can we guarantee that no one has to go homeless and hungry? No one has to suffer for lack of health care or lack of protection, right? How do we redefine the premise and principles of our society in a way that doesn't have to ensure that somebody has to suffer a hell on earth in order to guarantee that other folks can enjoy all that heaven has to offer? Mm-hmm. And then lastly, just on this note, Marx made this argument where he says the production of so many useful things creates so many useless people. And that becomes a very scary proposition, right? This notion that, once again, in a dialectical notion, we would say in a kind of Christian theological regard, right? The sinners and the saints, right? The saved and the damned, right? The righteous and the not, right? The irredeemable, right? This notion that somehow within a kind of zero-sum world, if you follow those kind of economic kind of arguments, right, that some folks have to suffer in order so that others can prosper. That ought not be an acceptable way of being in the world. That should not be a kind of mandatory approach to our ontology, right? Especially in a world in which we see a greater, more expansive limitlessness of human potential. And that's maybe a argument that I think permeates much of the book, right? This idea that the only limits at this stage of the game, the only limits that we can encounter are those that we impose upon ourselves.
And one of the things that I was trying to think of what might be a fun way of wrapping the conversation up, because there's so many different ways we could go, and
sure,
could have just talked to each of you for an hour. You end the book with a series of questions at the end about to really take into this alterization of culture, with a challenge after kind of reflecting on Gandhi about whether or not, if we take seriously the analysis, if we aren't engaging in religion that doesn't ask us to sacrifice anything and might be blindly sacrificing others on its altar. So in thinking of all that goes through the book, I thought maybe let each of you have a chance to share a question. It doesn't have to be one of those, but one of those that you hope, if someone takes the time to think more intentionally about the religious aspects of pop culture, that they would get disturbed by the question enough to wrestle with it.
Well, that's a really interesting thing to look at. I mean, we took Gandhi's 7 points, and the chapter is actually titled one of the 7, Worship Without Sacrifice. And to me, that is the biggest point. I mean, are we as Americans, or even North Americans, are we so concerned with having our needs met that we don't understand the notion of sacrifice any longer, or that we're not actually asking ourselves to be better people than we are now? And how do we get there? And it might mean sacrificing something that we are in order to become something better and make the world a better place. You know, I remember the old Sunday night sermon of Jimmy Carter at the end of that campaign when he lost to Ronald Reagan. And you know, he said one night on a Sunday night as president, there's a malaise, a spiritual malaise in this country, he said. And we've got to learn that as Americans, we shouldn't have it all. You know, that there are others in the world who need some of what we have. And isn't it time that we sacrifice a little bit and learn what it means to be better people? That may be the way out of this spiritual malaise we're in. And of course, the next morning, Ronald Reagan got up and said, look, we're in America. You can pull yourself up from your own bootstraps. You can have it all. You can be it all. You can be whatever you want to be. And that argument won the day, much the same way that Trump's argument has won the day. So I think my question would be, as Americans, how do we learn, once again, what it might mean to sacrifice something in order to become better than we are today?
Mm-hmm.
I think building off of that, my question would be, have we deified as Americans hubris over humility? That which is salvific about religion has been its way to show how service is the virtue that we have. And as Americans, historically, that country that was known as the land of the free and the home of the brave has now deified this notion of those things that are in service to us. We've deified our power over against our nation being a land of freedom and a land of refuge for all of its inhabitants. I think part of the Trump effect is not just being able to address the outcasts, right? Because we know that that's not the real investment. But we have, as Harvey Cox said, given ourselves over to a business theology of supply and demand. And we talk a good talk, knowing how to tap into what people want, but not how to serve them in the way of humility. As a Christian, my concern is that even Christianity and many American religious expressions of religion has also given itself over to this kind of positive thought materialism, where we have supplanted that which is serviceable and that which is in servant to humanity. We've supplanted that. We've allowed our hubris and our pride and the notion for power and prosperity to override that. So how comfortable are we considering ourselves a land of the powerful rather than the land of the free?
Mm-hmm.
I would ask the question, how does your belief, how does what you believe in help to make you and the world better? So often, if we start to live in these increasingly insular and insulated ways where everybody's walking around in their own hermetically sealed bubble and rejects and refuses to even acknowledge the concerns of someone else, even folks, not just folks that we are bound by blood or other kind of obvious relationships to form a relationship with, family members, loved ones, and the like. But obviously the stranger and in the most extreme case, our enemies, folks that we defined and described as our enemies, right? How do we worship? How do we pursue that thing, that ultimate concern, as Tillich phrases it, those godlike and quasi-godlike deities that William James was referring to? How do we pursue and seek to attain those things in a way that would have us shape and leave the world in a better situation than the way we found it, the way we came into it? Oftentimes, if you're seeking after money in an economic way, but that allows you to destroy and devastate the earth, right? Then your belief in economic concerns obviously is not leaving the world in a better shape. If your politics is all about winning rather than how do we, as Reinhold Niebuhr once said, find proximate solutions to insurmountable problems, right? Then that belief in politics is misguided. It's a form of disordered loves, as Augustine would say, right? If our belief in sports is, not doing what is seemingly impossible to the human condition, but more to the case, I'm going to do what I can get away with and try not to get caught, right? Then that is not a redemptive difference, right? If entertainment is simply about escaping this world and not necessarily enhancing this world, body and sex, if it's all about me and never about we, and ultimately science and technology, if you're thinking about science and technology in a way that is simply about exploiting other folks or experiencing what's in it for me individually, but not trying to seek some transcendent and greater good, then it's all vanity. It's all for naught. So ultimately, does what you believe in and what you worship and seek after make you and the world better?
Mm-hmm. Well, those are very powerful questions. And this is just like the tip of the iceberg of a very, very good book, The Altars Where We Worship, The Religious Significance of Popular Culture. Juan, Stacey, Mark, all three persons of the religiously engaged Trinity. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast.
We enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tripp, for so much great conversation.
Next time y'all publish something and it's just you, then we can talk one-on-one and get to talk longer. But I know coordinating all of y'all's schedules to do this together, it made it a ton of fun, and I hope everyone has enjoyed listening, and we'll go check out the book. Congratulations, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. You just finished a podcast. And for that, here's the thing. I think I want to give you something. I'm doing a giveaway right now. It is the Progressive Youth Ministry Toolkit. That's right. For this month of 2017, February, we're doing a giveaway. It's a toolkit, all sorts of really cool stuff, including a flask hole inside of a Bible, and lots of other things. That was just funny enough.
Yeah. So it's a Bible. It looks like a Bible. You open it up,
but it holds a flask.
Cut out for a flask.
Yeah.
I mean, every youth minister needs that.
And a headlamp. And a really sweet journal and pen. And it's a really cool set. You know what I mean? Jelly bean. And also we're giving away 30 copies of the brand new Homebrewed Christianity Guide to God. So if you want to know everything you need to know about the Almighty, then you should enter the giveaway. You should go to the website, homebrewedchristianity.com. Plus, you should come, if you're a youth minister, to PYM, that's Progressive Youth Ministry, March 8th to 10th. And you can come early for a little theological pregame on the 7th. Even if you're not a youth minister, on the 8th, you can just come to the live podcast. If you want to be in Asheville and see some beautiful trees, or you just live there and you're like, of course I'm going to be there. I live there. Then you should come to the podcast.
No excuses not to be there.
None. Also, if you're going to go to the event, use the code HBC. $50 off. You're welcome. So the other thing I was going to say is it's a secret, and I can't tell you. I know. It's a secret, but soon you'll find out about it. But let's say that you wanted to be among the first to find out about a secret.
How would you do such a thing?
Well, you might text the phrase, "Beer Me Jesus."
What number would you text "Beer Me Jesus" to?
44222.
So all I have to do is text "Beer Me Jesus" to 44222?
Yes.
And then I find out about this secret that you're not allowed to talk about?
Yes.
Oh, that's easy.
I don't know, who do you think might want to know about the secret?
Probably everyone.
Well,
but maybe specifically people who live in certain parts of the country.
Yes. Landlocked areas.
Yes. Flyover country, perhaps.
Oh, they don't like it when you say that.
I said perhaps. I said well, Ohio's not really.
Oh, I'm pretty sure it counts.
Well, maybe. The Rust Belt. We're from the Rust Belt. We have our own name.
Oh, my bad. Anyway, if you want to find out about a secret when the secret gets released, then you should check out Beer Me Jesus, because there may be info that arrives in your box before anyone else knows it about said summer plans, and then you get the cheapest discount and everything.
Yeah, it's really, there's no reason not to.
Well, I know if you don't like having fun.
Well, that's one, I guess.
You are like, this summer, what I don't want to do, I do not want to nerd out with my geek out with people in landlocked areas. If you're a coaster and you're like, none of that, no basket, don't do it. But if you're like, oh, that'd be awesome, then you'll find out where that could be possible, and you would find out which of my friends with a non-American accent would be there with me doing things.
Yeah. So, Beer Me Jesus.
Plus, they might just want to meet you in person, Nathan.
I mean, who? Yeah.
They said,
I'll be there.
I know. That's what I'm saying. But there, where? We don't even know what it is.
Exactly.
That's why you got to Beer Me Jesus. Yeah. So, that's all we have to say right now. But thanks for listening. And remember, we don't want to think for you. We want to think with you.
Amen.
Amen. Smoochy boochies.